Hello and welcome to this first video on grammar and distance. In this video, you'll learn how important grammar is when you want to be able to express yourself clearly and accurately. We'll explain how several factors can influence what kind of language and grammar we choose to use in a conversation or a written text. But before we begin, let's be honest. We all know that when we hear the word grammar, our first reaction might be, "Oh no, not grammar, run for your life." Unfortunately, this is a common preconception. For some people, grammar equals fear, and it brings back many bad memories from school with nasty grammar teachers punishing you for your mistakes. But this does not have to be like that anymore. In fact, this is what your English would look like without grammar. Chaos. No rules, no regulations, no conventions. Anything goes, but nobody understands what you mean because you're making so many mistakes, people cannot concentrate on what you're trying to say. This is not good. But if you live your life with good grammar, you have order, harmony, agreement, and understanding because you know what the rules and conventions are and you respect them. Not only are you understood, but when people hear you communicate, they say to themselves, "Wow, this person sounds so good, so articulate. What great grammar. They sound so educated." Then again, just because your grammar is great, it doesn't mean you should use it all the time. For instance, when dining with your family or friends, it would sound strange to use very formal, complicated language and grammar. It's much more common to use short phrases in such informal context like, "Want some? Yeah, sure. Lovely. Great. It tastes great. How was school today? Okay." In the same way, when we are doing some routine shopping at the bakery or a fast food, for example, we also normally use quite basic language. One of those, two croissants, a bottle of water, please, a Big Mac, please. So in English, if you're speaking to your friends or family or doing daily routine shopping tasks or having routine exchanges with your colleagues or classmates, it's quite normal to use simple language and grammar, as you can see here, between these two friends. In other words, because there is very little social distance between people, there is less need for long, complicated grammar. However, if you're in a formal situation at work, for example, and you meet a new colleague or client, it will be completely inappropriate to speak to them informally. You should communicate using full sentences with correct grammar and formal vocabulary. For an example of a formal conversation, listen to this short dialogue.
We haven't been properly introduced. My name is Bond, James Bond.
Pleased to meet you, Mr. Bond. I understand you are here to visit our new installation. It would be my pleasure to show you around.
I'm looking forward to that very much.
In this kind of first meeting, people need to use formal expressions and fully constructed sentences because there is a lot of social and possibly hierarchical distance between them. As we have more distance, it means there is a greater need for grammatically correct exchanges. So far, we've seen two types of distance: low social distance with less need for grammar, and high social distance with greater need for grammar. But there is also time distance. When we talk about the present, the here and now, we only really need to use the present tense as well as the context of the situation. For example, "It's sunny outside" is quite simple in terms of grammar and vocabulary. But if we speak about the same event in the past, we require more grammatical manipulation and more information about the context. For example, I remember a few years ago, it was when I was living in Rome. The summer there was so beautiful. The trouble was, it was incredibly hot. In this last version, there was a lot of context given at the beginning to make the sentence more understandable. We also had to use the past tense, past simple, and past progressive forms, and other language to describe this past event. So we can see that when we leave the present for the past or the future, we automatically need much more grammar and much more contextual information to make our story understandable. In this slide, we can see another example of this time-distance phenomenon. In version A, the facts are given in a direct manner. First, John arrived at 8:30 and Tam left at 8. There is no obvious connection between the two events. But in version B, we know that when John arrived, Tam had already left. This second version uses more complex grammar to explain the situation in more detail. This version could, for example, be used to describe who came to a party that you went to yesterday evening. You're telling your friend that there is no way that John could have spoken to Tam because she was no longer there when he arrived. The time phrase by the time plus past simple arrived plus past perfect Tam had already left is more complex than version A, but it is also much more precise. Now, back to the bakery. Physical distance is another factor that influences the kind of language and grammar we use. In version A, when we're actually in the bakery, it's very easy to point to things and say one of those, two of them, etc. We don't even need to know what their name is. But if we create more physical distance and, for example, place an order over the phone, we automatically need to be more formal, explain the reason for calling, give specific names and quantities of food we want, etc. And finally, we have hypothetical distance. What does this mean? Well, let's take the example of a woman finding some money on the street one day. She is happy to tell her friend about her good fortune. I was walking down the street the other day and I found a 20-euro note. It was great. It was the first time I ever found money like that. This is quite factual and it's easy to understand. It's something that happened the other day, but in version B, it's a different scenario. Here we're asking people to imagine what they would do if they found a 20-euro note on the street. Imagine you're walking down the street one day and suddenly you see some money on the pavement. Let's say it's 20 euros. What would you do? Would you pick it up? Would you check to make sure nobody's looking at you first? Would you hand it in to the police? This version requires abstract thinking to imagine the scenario in question. Suddenly, you see some money. What would you do? Let's say it's 20 euros. In order to be able to express such abstract ideas, we need a variety of language and grammar that is more sophisticated than in version A. Another area which creates greater hypothetical or cognitive distance is giving advice. Imagine someone borrows a car from a friend for the weekend, but during the weekend they scratch the car in a car park. It's only a small scratch. It's hardly noticeable. This person asks you for advice. You have two choices. In version A, you are direct and you say, tell him about it. He'll understand. Or version B, which is much more indirect and polite, phrases like, if I were you, I would, are typical in this kind of advice, which is used when you need to speak to someone about a delicate subject. This kind of hypothetical distance requires great skill in sentence construction and expression. In order to give more sophisticated or delicate advice, you need more grammar. To summarize this video, we've seen that there are different kinds of distance that make us change the kind of language and grammar we use. The greater the social distance between, let's say, a student and a professor or an employee and a boss, the greater the need for grammar. The greater the time difference in the past or the future, the greater the need for complicated grammatical structures and contextual details. Physical distance also forces us to be more specific and explicit in our sentences and grammar. If we're in the bakery, it's easy to point at things, but over the phone, we have to give much more detail. And finally, if we leave the real world around us to travel to a hypothetical world of imagine or what would you do, etc., we also create a greater need for grammar. In short, the greater the distance, the greater the need for grammar.